The scariest thing that I have ever seen happened while I was working as a security guard. There were no cameras outside of the store. It all started when I was doing my normal round. I worked the night shift at a convenience store in a rough part of town. It seemed like every night we would have some kind of trouble, whether it be someone trying to break in or just some sketchy people looking for something to steal. Since I was tall, I could easily reach it, but it was definitely too high for any customer to leave their mark. I wiped it off and figured that maybe some kid had gotten up on something and then put their hand on the door before going home. I didn't really think anything of it. I asked my co-workers about it, but none of them had any ideas. I was doing my rounds and checking the windows when I heard a noise by the front door. I walked over and looked out the window. All I saw was a small figure standing by the door. It was too dark to make out any details, but it looked like a small child. I stayed hidden behind the counter for a good 5 minutes until I regained my composure. Once I felt a little safer, I walked up to the door and turned on the bright overhead light. On the inside of the door was a small, distinct handprint. It looked exactly like a child's hand, and it wasn't there before. I quickly looked away, thinking that it was just some kid who snuck out of their house and was just walking around. I waited for hours, but nothing happened. As the night wore on, I started to calm down a bit. It was a small, scratching sound, like something trying to claw its way through the glass. My eyes darted around the room, looking for whatever was out there, but I couldn't find anything. It was a small voice, like a child's voice, and it seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. It whispered my name and beckoned me towards the door. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear. I quickly looked towards the door and saw 2 glowing eyes staring back at me. They were small, glowing yellow eyes, and they seemed to pierce through my soul. I locked the door behind me and huddled in the corner, trying to catch my breath. I started the engine and sped out of the parking lot. As I drove away, I could have sworn I saw the small figure standing by the door, but I didn't stop to check. I just kept driving. I don't know how long I stayed in the stockroom, but eventually the sun started to come up. All I know is that it's out there, and I'm scared of what it might do next. I cautiously opened the door and walked out. I could hear the creature outside the door, scratching and clawing, trying to get in. I screamed and fell backwards, hitting my head on the counter. Maybe it was just a raccoon or something, I thought. Maybe the police were right, and it was just some kids playing around. I didn't think much of it and continued my round. I reached up and felt a warm liquid on my fingers. Blood. Somehow the creature had managed to cut me, and I didn't even realize it. Some said it might be ghosts, but I laughed at that since I never believed in ghosts. When I walked up, I saw the small figure again, and it was now pressing its hand against the door. It pressed its whole body against the door, and for a moment I could see the imprint of its entire hand. It was something evil. That was the only explanation I could think of. Something evil was trying to get into the store. They didn't believe me, of course, and they told me to stop wasting their time. They said it was probably just some kids playing around, and that I should just ignore it. Best who... The creature had managed to break through the door and had apparently ransacked the place. Bah, I didn't care about the store. I didn't even care about my job. All I could think about was getting home. But I knew it wasn't kids. I knew there was something evil out there. It looked like a small child's hand. Immediately backed away and hid behind the counter. But most of the time it was pretty uneventful. Pre-hide them and ended the call. I didn't tell them anything else, because I knew they wouldn't believe me anyway. For the next few weeks, I kept seeing these small handprints appear on the doors. They were always in the same place and about the same size. I told my manager about it, and he said not to worry about it. He thought that maybe some kids were messing around outside the store, and that's how they were getting up there. One night I noticed a small handprint on the inside of our glass front doors. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary, since people do that sometimes. The parking lot was extremely well lit. There were lights everywhere, including motion sensor lights above the doors. And if anyone or anything was outside the store, the alarm would immediately go off. Plus, I would have seen them because I did my rounds every 20 minutes. So I knew if someone or something was outside the store. But what was weird was that it was way up high. You see, our front doors are those big glass doors that reach all the way to the floor. We keep them unlocked during business hours so customers can just walk right in. And once they're closed, we lock the doors but keep the locks engaged so the alarms don't go off. This makes it so that you can still see out of the doors, but no one can get in. Anyway, there was a small handprint on the inside of the door about 4 feet up. What I didn't know was that this was only the beginning. Now, you have to understand something about this store. Still, I couldn't help but feel uneasy every time I saw those handprints. Then, one night I saw something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. About 10 minutes later, I decided to check the front doors just to make sure. I watched as the small figure slowly walked away from the door and disappeared into the darkness. That's when it hit me. Whatever was out there wasn't a small child. I quickly called the police and explained what I had seen. The police hung up on me and told me to call them back if I saw anything else. So I stood by the counter by the front door and waited. But then I heard a noise by the door again. I froze and listened intently, dazed. I looked back towards the door. The eyes were gone, but there was now a large crack in the middle of the door. It had completely shattered. Then I heard a voice. As the voice continued to whisper my name, I felt something wet trickle down my face. But with newfound determination, I ran to the back of the store and hid in the stockroom. As the minutes passed, the scratching became more frantic, and I could hear the glass breaking. It was getting closer. Then, suddenly, it stopped. The store was a mess. So, I ran to my car as fast as I could and slammed the door shut. To this day, I don't know what that creature was. This is another true, scary story. True, so let me know if you would like this one read by someone else. This happened years ago when I was still in high school, and I needed to get a new car because mine had broken down and died in the parking lot of Burger King. And I had just gotten this beat-up old Geo Prism. It was super root back then. I think they like Geo now instead of Chevy. But anyway, it was cheap, and it ran so I could get to and from school and work. Even as a kid, the yard was filled with these giant oak trees that had Spanish moss hanging from them. And the house was all boarded up with a rusty old swing set in the front yard. I remember thinking how strange it was that no one lived there. Poof. Also, let me know down below if you have ever had a GPS lead you astray. But for whatever reason, I continued on. There was a driveway that led to the house, and I pulled in. I felt a chill go down my spine, and it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was just like this unintelligible sound, like right before you go deaf. That moment when everything goes quiet. I don't remember what made me do it, but I guess I wanted proof that this place existed. And I wanted to show somebody what I thought I had seen. So I turned around and went back. That's what it sounded like. And then I took off running. It looked normal, like the windows that were boarded up before were gone, and now there was glass in the window. And the yard looked neat and tidy, like someone had just mowed the lawn and trimmed the bushes. And I can still remember how awful it was to realize that my GPS had somehow given me the address of a house that had never existed. I never found out who that old woman was, or what she was doing, living in a house that was there, and every time I hear a knock in the middle of the night, I think about that old woman and her vacant eye. And the oak trees didn't have any moss hanging from them. They were just bare branches. Ooh. And I could feel myself getting scared. So I decided to just drive back down this dirt road and head home. But when I knocked, I heard footsteps inside. And then I heard the heavy thud again, like someone was trying to get out. Word. And then I heard this faint voice. It said, "Who's there?" And it was an old woman's voice. And as I got closer, I noticed that there was a rocking chair on the porch. And then I knocked again, and the voice said, "Coming." She was wearing one of those old nightgowns that comes down to your ankles. And she looked me up and down with these big vacant eyes, and she said, "Can I help you?" I don't remember what I said. I think I told her that I was lost or something. I tried to explain that my GPs had sent me there, and that I didn't mean to bother her. But she just stared at me with these soulless eyes, and she said, "You're not the first one to come looking." Then she closed the door and turned off the lights. I could hear what sounded like shuffling feet, and then the doorknob started to turn, and then the door opened. And when I looked over, I saw this same rocking chair sitting on the other side of the porch, facing away from me. And the rocking chairs were still moving slowly back and forth. I heard them pacing back and forth on the other side of the wall, just like this heavy thud, 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 back and forth. I don't know what it was, but it sounded like someone was trying to get out of the house. Porch was made of. But I remember knocking on it and making a loud sound and then running away as fast as I could. I wasn't sure if I had imagined seeing it or not, so I quickly parked my car in the yard and walked over to the porch to check. It was an old wooden rocking chair with a faded blue cushion on it. And even though it was the middle of the day and there wasn't a breeze, The chain on the chair was moving back and forth, really slowly, like someone was sitting there rocking back and forth. Because this one did, and it's one of the reasons I don't use them anymore. But yeah, here we go. Now, this was weird because I had never programmed this address in before, and I knew it was Una, my grandmother S. The GPS lady said in a monotone voice, recalculating, and then she gave directions to turn left at the next street and then right onto a dirt road. And the weird thing was I knew this dirt road. It was a dead end that went to a creek and had a bunch of houses on it. None of them were mine. Alright, I was driving home from my grandmother's house. Well, on this particular day, I was heading home after visiting my grandmother. She lives out in the sticks on some acreage, and there's hardly any houses around her. Well, I got about 2 miles down the road and my GPS decided to shut off, which wasn't unusual because it was one of those older ones, and the battery life was horrible. Well, I didn't really know the area all that well, but I knew I had passed my road, so I figured I would just turn around at this next intersection and head back. Well, the weird thing was I looked on the GPS, and I saw that I had an address saved in the system for home. I continued on down the road, though, because I was curious what the hell this address was doing on my GPS. And then it said to turn left again, and then it would take me to home. Well, I turned left, and there was a house at the end of this road. I couldn't see the house numbers, but I recognized it, because it was the only house on this little loop road, and it had been vacant for years. I knew it was vacant because I used to play in the woods behind it when I was little. And the thing about this house was I remembered how creepy it always looked pre. And even though the GPS said I had arrived at my destination, I hesitated to stop there because I knew no one lived there. I remember stopping in the driveway and just staring at this house and thinking, what the hell? Well, as I started to pull out of the driveway, I noticed something strange in the corner of my eye. Well, when I got close enough to look through the gaps in the boards, I could have sworn that there was a pair of feet resting on the floor on either side of the rocking chair. But I could have sworn that as soon as I knocked on the porch and ran off, I heard footsteps inside the house. And then I heard what sounded like a voice, but it was too distorted to make out any word. Well, I jumped in my car and floored it and turned down the dirt road and headed back to the main road. And sure enough, the house was still there, but now it looked different. So I stopped and knocked on the door. And I don't know why I did this because I already knew no one was home. I remember just standing there with my hand on the door, frozen, not knowing whether or not to keep knocking. Brew. And on the other side stood this hunched-over old woman with white hair. And that was that. I never saw her again, and I never saw that house again. Thanks for listening. Bye. If you liked this one, please hit the subscribe button. I will catch you guys on the flip side. Bye. Every morning I would wake up and my chair would be pulled out. Now, when I say pulled out, I mean it would be sitting where it was supposed to be the night before. But now it would be halfway across the room. And this was happening with all 4 chairs around our dining room table. Also, we don't have any pets that could have done it, nor do we have any kids. So we were completely baffled. It didn't happen all the time, but it happened often enough to be really annoying. And it was always happening in the exact same spot. My wife and I had recently moved into an old farmhouse with our 2 kids, Pages 4 and 2. My wife and I started taking turns, getting up during the night to see if we could catch whatever or whoever was doing this. But obviously we never saw anything. One of the knives slipped out of the drawer and landed on the floor with a sickening thud. The shadow didn't seem to acknowledge the noise, though it just stood there staring straight ahead for a full 60 seconds. Then it turned and walked slowly out of the kitchen and down the hallway. We absolutely loved the house, but there were some strange things going on that we just couldn't explain. But if it wasn't human, then what was it? Was it some kind of ghost? Birds? Why was it moving the chairs and opening the silverware drawer? And why was it staring at the camera? For instance, every morning when my wife would get up to make coffee, she would notice that the kitchen chairs had been pulled out during the night. We couldn't keep living in a house where the walls themselves seemed to be closing in on us. So we packed up our things and we left. And when I look over, I can almost see the shadow standing in the corner of the room, watching me, waiting for me to leave so it can come out and play. But when we checked the footage, we found something even more disturbing. In another, it was sitting in one of the chairs, its back to us as we talked. But why? Was it trying to scare us away? Was it trying to protect us from something? Or was it simply curious about its new house guests? And in yet another, it was standing by the window, its face pressed against the glass. The shadow had been in several of the previous videos, but we had never noticed it before, because it had blended in with the darkness. There was a shadow that slid out from underneath the dining room table, and then it walked over to one of the chairs and started pushing it away from the table. It was in the walls. It was in the windows. It was everywhere. And every time we saw it, it seemed to get closer and closer. We watched in disbelief as the shadow continued to push the chairs away one by one until they were all lined up neatly in a row. Then it did something else that made our blood run cold. I can tell you how to... Sir would be about 2 or 3 feet away from the table. We didn't see it, but the next morning we found our bed in a state of disarray. The sheets were ripped, the pillows were scattered on the floor, and the blankets had been pulled off the bed. Now, my wife and I always pushed our chairs in before we went to bed, so we knew that we hadn't done it ourselves. There was no other furniture in the kitchen, so there was nothing for the chairs to slide against. They were literally moving through solid object. One night, my wife noticed that the silverware drawer was also slightly open, but it was always shut tightly when we went to bed. Well, after about a week of this nonsense, we decided to set up a camera to catch whatever was going on. We positioned the camera so that it could see the entire kitchen. Then we turned off all of the lights, except for the red light on the camera itself. Then we waited. About an hour went by and we were just about to call it a night when suddenly we saw something. Boop, The shadow walked over to the silverware drawer and pulled it open, revealing rows and rows of gleaming silverware. My wife and I looked at each other in disbelief. What we had just seen was not human. No human being could move like that. We decided to check the cameras from the past few nights, hoping that we might be able to find some other clues. In one of the videos, we could see it standing in the corner of the room, watching us as we ate dinner. It was obvious at this point that whatever this thing was, it was stalking us. It wanted us to know that it was there. As the days went by, the shadow continued to appear in the most unexpected places. Then one night it came into our bedroom while we were sleeping. We knew at that point that we had to do something drastic. We haven't been back to that house in years, but sometimes when I'm home alone at night, I swear I can hear the chairs scraping across the floor.